But I'm on the leadership team of Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts. Welcome to our forum this morning on legislative dysfunction. Just a very quick background on, actually, I should note that we are recording this meeting. We record all our forums, so they're available on our website afterwards. So you're all aware of that we're recording. Just very quick background on PDM. We were founded in 2003. We were a group of volunteers from Bob Reich's campaign for governor here in Massachusetts, and we wanted to maintain the infrastructure of progressive activists in between, after the campaign and in between campaigns. So we formed PDM. We are all volunteers. We are statewide, and we are solely focused on state and local policies and elections to state and local offices. We conducted our first forum just over 3 years ago in January of 2021. And coincidentally, it was making our Massachusetts legislature more transparent and effective. After that forum, we formed the Legislative Reform Working Group of PDM. We worked throughout the year doing research and produced a report in the fall of 2021 that was called Massachusetts Legislature, Democracy in Decline, which is available on our website. We've been doing roughly monthly forums ever since. And as I mentioned, they're all out on our website and recorded, so you can go and look at them and listen to them if you're so interested. We will give you the link to our website in just a bit. But I want to get right into today's forum. First of all, just one quick note. Please use the chat only for questions you have that you'd like the moderator or panelists to respond to, or to provide links to relevant information. Please do not engage in side conversations. Those are very distracting. As I mentioned, we are recording. And at this point, without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator today, who is Scotia Hilla, who's the Executive Director of Act on Mass, which I imagine, as many of you know, has been working hard on these issues of legislative transparency and accountability here in Massachusetts for a number of years. So, Scotia.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks to Progressive Dems of Mass for hosting this conversation today. I'm so excited to chat with you. I'm just going to start off with some opening remarks. So, hi, everyone. I'm Scotia from Act on Mass. Act on Mass is a nonprofit that was founded in 2018 by a group of progressive activists to bring attention to the problems in our legislature. We work as a watchdog organization, tracking key progressive bills through the legislature, following the ins and outs of the legislative process, and keeping the public informed about what's going on via our weekly newsletter, The Saturday Scoop, and also our social media accounts. We also advocate for common sense rules reforms and transparency-based legislation, and I'm really excited to be chatting with you all today. I want to start off by acknowledging that we are meeting at a very difficult time for progressives around the country. This is a time when our federal government being gutted before our eyes and the institutions in place cannot be trusted to serve as real checks on power. So our eyes are really turning to our state leaders for stability and a meaningful alternative. At least for me, this is something that keeps coming up in conversations with allies, with neighbors, with family members, and I'm sure that's the case for many of you folks too. And it's a question with real material consequences. LGBTQ folks in states that have become unsafe will be looking for a safe haven. Immigrants that fear federal raids might be looking for a place to raise their families in peace. And I think most of us on this call believe that Massachusetts is that place or can be. However, those of us who have spent time working to bring forth that vision in Massachusetts state government would be right to have some meaningful doubts. Many of you know very well that the process of translating our progressive values into legally binding laws that can actually be relied upon is an onerous and disillusioning one. And you would also know, unfortunately, that authoritarian styles of government where decisions are made unilaterally with little regard for checks and balances, leaving citizens, advocates, and rank-and-file lawmakers alike scrambling to respond, is unfortunately not merely a federal phenomenon, but exists in our own backyard. Ideally, representative state democracy functions just like how we learn about it in grade school. Every 2 years, the public gets to select a representative and a senator from a diverse slate of their peers based on the policies that that person says that they'll support in office. That representative then spends the next 2 years introducing bills, advocating for these bills with their peers, voting on bills in committee, engaging in debates on the floor of their chamber, and making final votes on bills to be passed. Then, at the end of 2 years, their citizens get the chance to consider that record and then vote to re-elect their representative or not. I think I see some smiles. So obviously that is not what we're dealing with in Massachusetts. And it would take a whole other hour to walk through how anti-democratic features at every step in the process combine to interrupt the process of representation. But at Act on Mass, we like to zero in on two key parts of that problem: the lack of transparency in our state government and the concentration of power and leadership. At this point, you've probably heard that Massachusetts has one of the least transparent legislatures in the country. Massachusetts is the only state in the country in which all three branches of government hold themselves exempt from public records law. For context, for what that means, only 2 other states have 2 branches exempt. So we're truly in a world of our own. This also means that town meetings in my hometown of Natick or city council in my current home of Cambridge are subject to stricter public scrutiny than the body that doles out our $62 billion state budget. Massachusetts is also one of few states in which committee votes are not publicly released. In recent years, accounting by our friends at Progressive Mass shows that fewer and fewer votes are being taken on the floor of the House or Senate. Therefore, these days, the lion's share of lawmaking work is done in committee, where public markup sessions are no longer held and votes are taken in secret. To illustrate the consequences of this, I'll share a story told to me by one of our progressive allies. This person had spent many sessions advocating for a common sense, popular piece of progressive legislation in Mass without it ever receiving a vote on the floor. A similar bill with identical consequences then passed easily in one session of the legislature in California. My friend reached out to the group advocating for this change in California to get their advice and learn how they'd been able to pass it so quickly. The group from California was confused. They said, "We're not sure if the committee actually agreed with it, but no one wanted to be seen voting it down in committee." Without this public venue for their votes in Massachusetts, our reps are afforded coverage to continually send popular legislation to study, which means killing it, resulting in outcomes that are the opposite of progressive. With a declining number of public votes on the floor and no committee votes, our rank and file representatives are then left with little to show for themselves at the end of 2 years to prove to their constituents that they're worth re-electing. The lack of transparency then drives the concentration of power, as rank and file representatives are forced to go begging to House and Senate leadership for earmarks on budget and appropriation bills in order to have something to show for themselves at the end of 2 years. You've probably seen this behavior from your own representative, touting the $25,000 grant that they got for the high school or a new park, without a mention of the legislative priorities that they ran on. Look, most rank and file members of the House and Senate are genuinely there because they're good people who want to do right by their communities and neighbors. It's important then to focus on the ways that structures and incentives work to shift these representatives' priorities away from the power of the people that we give them when we vote for them and towards the power of hierarchical leadership. In our national Congress, committee chairmanships are voted on by the body. In Massachusetts, they're doled out by the Speaker and Senate President unilaterally. And in our state legislature, these positions come with huge paid incentives. You've probably seen the great reporting that the Boston Globe did on this year. At this point, 109 members of the House and all 40 members of the Senate receive a leadership stipend. Therefore, the Speaker unilaterally controls pay for more than the majority of the legislature in the House, and it's also true for the Senate President. This system is used as both stick and carrot, where there's always an incentive to kind of kiss up so that you can move up a rung, and also the Speaker and Senate President can and have stripped members of lucrative positions after they stepped out of line. All these incentives result in a system where, in the last Democratic legislative session, 85% of Democratic representatives voted with the Speaker 100% of the time. 100% of the time. That means for all of us on this call that are represented by Democrats, 8 out of 10 of us are essentially being represented by a single conservative white guy from Quincy. Just as we are disempowered to hold our representatives accountable by the lack of transparency, our representative is disempowered from their constitutionally granted ability to represent us in the lawmaking process. And this system is unfolding right now. Legislative session has kicked off, but representatives will wait another few weeks to receive their committee assignments, those assignments that come with lucrative pay bonuses, as you remember. For context, every other state in New England makes committee assignments by the first day of session. Our leaders like to make our representatives sweat and make sure that they stay in line for the crucial vote on House, Senate, and joint rules that will be happening in a couple of weeks. So keep this in mind as the session unfolds too. Whenever something seems like delay or procrastination, there's usually a power structure behind it. This is also the reason that so much lawmaking is reserved for the very end of session. If a leadership allows a member's priority to bill to be passed early in the session, they lose leverage over that representative to whip them for other votes. As disheartening as the system can be, there are signs that the public is waking up and becoming aware of the problems of dysfunction in the legislature. And we can look no further than the resounding victory of question 1, where every town and city in the Commonwealth declared that the legislature should not be trusted to audit itself. This message is taking hold even within leadership, who have indicated a potential openness to transparency reforms. And Act en Masse was very proud to join with fellow progressives in a joint letter to give legislators a clear picture just what the public's idea of transparency looks like. And this movement also starts with conversations just like these, where citizens gather together to take our despair and anger at the state of the world and channel it into learning and action. The great panelists that you're going to hear from today are folks that are true experts at this work of channeling anger into a movement towards justice. So I'm very proud to introduce them and looking forward to the conversation that we'll have. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. We are thrilled to have Alan Page, one second, of the Better Future Project, which is a statewide leader in the fight for just solutions to the climate crisis. Alan has spent years advocating for climate progress at the municipal, state, and national level. And we're thrilled to be chatting with him today. We also have Mark Martinez. Mark is a staff attorney at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute in the Housing Unit. Prior to his current role, he spent 3 years working as legal counsel in the state Senate, where he also co-founded a collective of State House staff members called Beacon Bloc, advocating for cultural and institutional changes on Beacon Hill to better recruit, retain, and support staffers of color. So without further ado, I will open the floor to Mark and Alan for their opening remarks. Maybe Alan, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Scotia. Hi, everybody. I'm Alan Palm with the Better Future Project. And yeah, Scotia, thank you for laying out the challenges that we face so well. I think from a climate advocate's point of view, but really for anybody advocating for any issue, I'm thinking about this. I'm separating like what we've been able to accomplish from the how it was accomplished. So I've came into this work as an organizer, and so that's organizing and mobilizing people to pressure their constituents. And while over the past 7 years that I've been engaged in this kind of deeply, we've been able to like wring out some meaningful victories, and compared to the really low bar of progress in many other states on climate and the federal government, like that looks pretty decent. But when you contrast that with, say, what is possible for Massachusetts to do, what are the standards for climate action in the Democratic Party's own platform, what is necessary for us to do to really be an example to other states and to the federal government of the way that climate action can really improve people's lives, their health, their well-being, and our economy. There's so much more that we need to do, but ultimately, I think like it's disempowering for advocates and for citizens to try to engage in the government when the process is so hostile to their engagement throughout. Like when you contrast what's happening at the state level with what we learn in Schoolhouse Rock and how it's supposed to work, it's so difficult for even full-time advocates to make it in their schedules to show up at a bill hearing with less than a week's notice, to follow the results of what comes out of a committee, a 100-page bill that comes out of a conference committee with a half day to introduce amendments and 24 hours to then vote on them. There's no way that ordinary citizens can engage in this process and provide oversight. And that is really damaging to trust in government, and it's really damaging to the outcomes that we need. So I think maybe just to conclude my opening remarks here, what I would like us to do collectively going forward is to be able to claim the space as advocates that we can say that 2 + 2 = 4 when we're meeting with our representatives, that we can say, hey, you are the least transparent state government in the country, and that's shameful. And we appreciate what you're doing to move forward our issues, but transparency and democratic accountability is an issue for everyone, and we need you to move that forward as well, and not replicate the kind of chilling effects that happen within the state government where reps are intimidated from speaking up about transparency. We need to be able to hold that line in solidarity with one another and have the courage to speak up about transparency while advocating for our issues. So I'm pleased to be here with you all to kind of bring that reality about. And and continue to press for alignment with our stated values when it comes to democracy and transparency. So thanks, pleased to be here.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, that's such a key point too, because the State House is always touting, well, don't worry about the process, look at everything that we're doing. But it's such an important message that the process really does matter, and it also affects, the ability of everyday citizens as well as advocates to engage in the process. Mark, why don't you take your turn?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Alan covered a lot of the stuff from like an advocate perspective that is, problematic. And so I think I'll take it from a slightly different perspective. Like Scotia said, I used to be a staffer. I worked in the State House for 3 years and interned a bunch prior to that. And so I've been in and around the State House for close to 10 years now. And, I think that, I think there's a few things that I've realized in, that amount of time is that, one, as we've gone along every session, this legislature has gotten less and less productive. I think as it gets less transparent, it gets less productive. I think as power gets consolidated at the top and more consolidated in a few individuals, the legislature just gets far less productive. I can remember doing my first internship in the State House in 2016. And my job every week was to prepare the senator that I was interning for, was to prepare his binder for the bills that were going to be debated that week, because they were on the floor debating 2 to 3 bills every week, and passing bills through various chambers every week, not necessarily, making it to the governor's desk. But every week that I was there, we were passing legislation, we were debating legislation, passing standalone bills, and that has just, the amount that has happened has decreased significantly to the point now where we really kind of only do big, large omnibus bills or pass things through the budget process. And so I think that is a really bad process. It leads to really bad outcomes. And the other thing that is important to note is, as much as I've been around the building, there are still things that happen every year process-wise, and I'm like, what is that? I've never seen or heard of that before. And it, as someone whose job it was to understand the process of the State House for many years, if I'm still getting confused by the process and how opaque it is, I can only imagine what it is like if you're an advocate on the outside, or if you're just a person that's not, a paid advocate that wants to live their life, but also still have a voice in what's happening in the State House. To understand that when it is not your full-time job is incredibly difficult. I think that, I don't think that this is a hot take here, but I think we make better laws when more people are able to participate, when more voices are able to heard and people are able to understand. I also think the thing that makes people really cynical is, even if you have the wherewithal to get into your senator or your rep's office, they will often use the convoluted process to avoid having to engage with you around the actual policy that you're talking about. And so, you can go in and say, hey, I really care about this housing thing, and I want you to co-sponsor this bill. And then they start to talk to you about all the process reasons why they can't do that, rather than actually engaging with you about whether or not they actually agree with the policy that you're there to talk about. And so I think that is by design. And I think that people being able to understand that process now helps cut down on that. And I also think simplifying the process will, allow constituents to better engage with their legislators, and really be able to nail them down on, hey, do you believe in these things that are really foundational to what I believe in and that I think we have to be prioritizing? And so, it leads to things happening where we know we have the support, and we know if we could, do a blind vote of legislators on lots of things, we'd probably get it done, but that's not the process. And so, yeah, I guess that's my big takeaway is, the State House has always been very flawed, but it continues to get worse every year. And if that trend continues, I don't know how we get much worse than what happened last session, but I'm sure the legislature will unfortunately continue to surprise me in the ways in which it can be wildly unproductive. And so I think these conversations are really important. And I think this is important because I think conversations around transparency have always felt very separate to policy conversations, which has made it a hard thing to talk about with folks. And so I think that the more that people understand how the dysfunction of the State House directly connects to the things that they care about, I think can hopefully help to kind of crack that open a little bit more.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, those are some really awesome points. So now we're going to move to questions. I'm going to start off pretty broadly. Do you guys want to just kind of walk us through the moment that you realized that advocacy in Massachusetts was not like other states? And, you know, maybe why advocacy is so difficult and often unproductive in Massachusetts?
Sure, I can start. I think it's I do actually remember the moment distinctly. So I started working as the director of organizing for 350 Mass in 2017. And just to kind of put us back in time, it was another one of those first half of the year within within the Trump administration. And I remember working with so many passionate activists within the 350 Mass space, lobbying their constituents with our partners within the Mass Power Forward Coalition, and we are pushing for increases in the renewable energy portfolio standard, environmental justice to be codified into law, and we're getting a lot of co-sponsors for these policies. And then in the final months of the session in 2018, the policies that we are pushing for disappeared, whether it was in the House Ways and Means Committee or it was in the conference committee. And we had very little opportunity. There was like I didn't really understand the disconnect that you could have something that was so broadly supported disappear within a committee with no one being able to be held accountable for it besides maybe the committee chair because there was no public votes. And that the policies that were like broadly supported were not even coming up for roll call votes when the omnibus legislation was actually passed. And so that was a really underwhelming session, and it was in great contrast to what was happening on the national level in regard to backsliding on climate action, that I was like extremely dismayed. And I think like disillusioned, was like my illusions like that we had a functioning democracy faded away in that session. And I think like since then, myself and I think the activists at 350 Mass and a lot of our allies have become more assertive in pushing for transparency measures as well. So we ran some non-binding ballot referendums pushing for transparency. And I think we've tried to claim that transparency is important for the how of the outcomes that we want, in addition to what actually gets across. Because while, and I maybe mentioned this before, is like Massachusetts claims to be a leader in so many ways, like it's really important for us to have a democracy and a civic engagement process that people can trust and is transparent, when trust and faith in government is at an all-time low on the federal level, and people are putting their faith into authoritarians instead. Like the democratic inaction or operating behind closed doors has real cultural consequences. It has real policy consequences. And I think that what I've learned in several sessions of advocacy is that we need to be assertive and aggressive. That doesn't mean that we all need to use the same tactics, but we need to be in solidarity with one another and be supportive and not try to sell out or to disavow alliances with people who are pushing for have the same values as us, because they might use more aggressive tactics to try to like find a track to get to leadership. I think that we need to claim what our principles are, claim what our values are, and be unapologetic about that, and let the legislators be the ones who compromise. We should be bold and claim our principles, that we believe in democracy, we believe in transparency, and we want those things upheld.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about different than other states because I've only lived in Massachusetts. But, I think, I'll never forget when I first started at the State House, I thought I had to be really careful about what I would put in email. And then I didn't find out until months later that we weren't subject to public records requests. So it didn't matter what I put in my email, which was a shock to me. And I also think I do a lot of advocacy at the city level as well. And so seeing, that like 3 city councilors can't get together and talk about a policy without having, without giving like 48 hours notice and having public comment But obviously in the legislature, that's not the case. And so I think that comparison was really stark for me. The lack of access of the public, from, as someone on the inside, and realizing how much people just do not understand the process was really, really jarring to me. I think why is it so difficult? I think a long time ago, there was a group of senators that ceded power to a certain group of, very small group, or reps as well, that ceded power. And I think once you cede power, it's really hard to get it back. And so I think that becomes really challenging. I also think that there are a lot of reps, I'll be honest in this, I think there are a lot of reps that appreciate that they're powerless. I think that it gives them an excuse to not have to engage with things. If they know they don't have real power to make a decision, then they don't have to stress about making decisions. And so I think there are a lot of people who this system benefits. And then lastly, what was the other thing that I was going to say? Oh, I think Massachusetts really, and I still hear to this day, I think there are a lot of legislators that ride some of the old successes of like a progressive Massachusetts. The number of reps that will still talk about Massachusetts being the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, right? And they will still kind of ride that as reasons to not have to do other things, or as cover to not do other things. And there are, I think to a certain extent we allow them to do that. This kind of Massachusetts exceptionalism comes into play. And so I think that, those are some of the reasons, not an exhaustive list, but some of the reasons it's really hard to get things done and why Massachusetts functions the way that it does.
Yeah, thank you. Those are some really good perspectives. I think especially the point about some lawmakers appreciating the process a bit. It allows them to focus on their full-time job of attending ribbon cuttings and, chaperoning prom, which apparently is one of Ron Mariano's favorite things to do in his district. It's much nicer to have a full-time job being like, every district's favorite guy than, actually doing the hard work of lawmaking and having to debate with your colleagues. So that is something that I sometimes underestimate. So for another question, for folks that are just learning about the problems in the Massachusetts legislature, what do you think is like the most important thing to understand? Or, if you have a new activist that's starting up with you, what is like the first thing that you tell them?
I think that's a challenging question because I want folks, as an organizer, I want folks to feel empowered, right? And I think that, but the harsh reality is that unless you kind of like need a path to leadership in order to move the policy that you want. And that's really unfortunate. And so I don't know if this is actually truthfully answering like what I would say to an activist, but I think we do have to tell people like the truth about what happens at the State House and sort of the contrast with with what a functioning and participatory democracy would look like. But yeah, the reality is that that's unfortunately like very disempowering. And that's not what we want for our activists, for people to be civically engaged. So I think that I would, and maybe to get that across, I would push them to just be honest and to be upfront about with their reps, to sort of like not accept their framing of why they can't do something because that's because of the norms of the State House, and to ask them maybe transparently, is be like, do you have to do it that way? Like, are you following, is this because of the merits of the policy, or is that because of the norms of the State House? And I guess like to try to establish a relationship where you put the cards on the table and acknowledge the challenges that they face because of lack of transparency and talk about it. And I think that that's maybe something that I would actually have with an activist a couple conversations in. But I think that would be kind of strategically my approach for people to frame their relationships with their reps as one where they don't pretend that we have a democracy. They acknowledge the difficulties in getting it passed, and they acknowledge that those are problems that also need to be addressed. in addition to whatever specific other policies, be they climate, economic development, what have you.
Yeah, and I would just I would echo everything there. And I would say, this system is designed to be opaque so that it can wear you down so that you stop participating, which is all the more reason you have to keep on participating. Right. I think the biggest mistake that I see, and what I always try to tell advocates, especially when they're new, I mean, even if they're not new, when they're engaging with their legislators, is demand an answer from them. Right. Like, don't just email them and say, hey, rep, co-sponsor such and such a bill. Right. Say co-sponsor this and respond and say, and please let me know if you are or not. Right. Because if you don't demand a response, they're not going to give you one unless they're right happy and they agree with you and they want to like let you know how much in alignment you are. Right. Like, they are not going to do anything more than you ask them to do. And so, I always, if I'm sending out sample emails that people can send, I always include language around make sure that you ask them to respond to you. They don't respond to your email, give them a call, make them give you an answer. I think is the other thing. At the end of the day, like, that's what they have to do. And don't let them try to learn the process so they can't use it to circumvent giving you a straight answer. And even if you don't, you can say, okay, cool, maybe we're past the co-sponsorship deadline, but how do you feel about this policy? Like, I don't actually care about the bill. I want to know how you feel about this particular policy, and make them give you an answer. And they'll probably give you some BS like, well, we'll have to look into it. Okay, cool. I'm going to call you in a couple of weeks. I hope you've looked into it by then. And I think you have to nail them down, because we have to start somewhere, the process of being able to hold these folks accountable. And then the other thing I will say just quickly is, like, it is hard, and it is really hard to lose faith. But the other thing that I will say is we've had really big victories, right? And I don't say that to legitimize the legislature, legitimize anything that they do. It's largely happened in spite of them. But good things have happened. We've done big things. And so it's hard, and we are trying to make it easier to do big things, but don't lose hope, because those things can happen, and these things have to happen.
I would just tag that with is I would say anticipate, like, when you're providing like tough love for your representatives, that some of them are quite sensitive to this, but that probably if you get a hostile reaction, like it's more of an indication that you're doing something right. And that's often a more effective way. Like, not that we want to be unnecessarily hostile, but we want to be honest. And sometimes just being honest with our representatives can inspire a hostile reaction. But that also is a signal that they're paying attention. And sometimes you do, contrary to the idiom, I guess, like, catch more flies with vinegar than you do with honey. If the status quo is not working, like, getting them to recognize that you're not happy with that is more effective than accepting their platitudes.
Yeah, those are such great perspectives. And I think this is something that comes up a lot in, trainings that Act on Mass does, or similar conversations that I've been involved in, is just like, our reps are so not used to hearing from us at all, and so not used to being asked to take a strict policy position, because they so infrequently have to take recorded votes, that simply asking for a yes or no position can often inspire a lot of difficulty. But it means that individual citizens are really powerful in even just in a one-on-one conversation, being able to get a straight answer out of a representative. And that's a power that we can hold as citizen activists. All right, here's another interesting question. So you both have obviously been organizing in Massachusetts for a long time, both inside and outside the building. How do you feel that the issues at the legislature, Mark, you touched on this a bit in your opening remarks, but how do you feel that these issues have kind of evolved over time, and how they've changed the advocacy that we're able to do?
I'll start. And actually, Mark, it was kind of shocking for me to hear of what you were talking about in 2016, because I was directly involved at that time, and thinking about debates, like public debates on the floor and individual bills being voted on, seems amazing. And so I think by a number of objective measures that the State House has become less transparent and less productive over the last several sessions. And And that's really disturbing. I think another example of this that's somewhat maddening is the timelines upon which things operate. So there's sort of like this acceptance that nothing is going to happen for 18 months until the last month of the legislative session, when all of the individual policies will be negotiated into omnibus bills behind closed doors, and then to be voted on at like before the stroke of midnight on July 31st. But as we've seen in a couple of sessions, so the 2020 session, they had the excuse of the pandemic, and in order to extend the session and to do business past their self-imposed, as far as I understand it, July 31st deadline. But then in this past session, it was one from the people who are into the climate and energy policy will understand that the Joint Committee on Telecoms, Utilities, and Energy did not meet as a joint committee. It held separate. It acted as two independent committees of one another, both in the House and the Senate, dealing with overlapping policies, but not in any public way communicating with one another until they went into conference committee in like the very last moments of the legislative session. And so they were not able to produce a climate bill and along with a number of other policies by that deadline. And the reaction seemed to be like the next morning of like, well, we'll just pick it up. Sorry, I know that this is technically an emergency and civilization's at stake, but we'll get to it next session. And I know that the advocates and activists were aggressively pushing, as we had throughout this session. And then the governor also weighed in and to ask for them to get back to work on her economic development, on the economic development bill that was a priority for her. And so with, I think, a combination of the governor prompting them and with continued pressure, we were able to get a decent climate bill through this session, like sometime in the fall. But it really just feels like being like led around by the nose by these legislators in regard to sticking to some timeline that feels ironclad for us, but then if they don't meet it, they can either just choose to pick up work or not. So I think that's just another example of it becoming like less accessible and more hostile to the average citizen who's trying to follow and participate in the process with not very much regard for civic engagement throughout this process. So yeah, that's kind of been my experience of this continued degeneration, I guess, of the democratic norms here.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly, like I said, I to repeat some of what I said is, we're debating less bills, we're passing less bills, we're taking less roll call votes. That's decreased significantly over the years. The budget process is taking not as much because they're consolidating a lot more through the budget process, which is happening at the same time that they're passing more policy through the budget than anything else. At the same time, the participatory process of the budget is decreasing. When I first started doing budgets, those were late nights every night for an entire week. And now they're getting through the budget in 3 days. It's really 2 days, and they're partially extending it for a third day to make it look like they're still debating things in the budget. But it's the biggest, most important thing we do every year. And what used to take a week is taking a couple of days, and they call it efficient, but really what it is just like more, power centralization and just more kind of crushing of debate around the budget, which is really bad. And the other thing that is true that hasn't been mentioned yet is like the other thing that's gotten worse is the relationship between the speaker and the Senate president, which actually has really, really bad implications. A lot of good things don't get done because two individuals from Ashland and Quincy just like don't seem to like each other very much. And both chambers will engage in this like bartering system, in conference committees where it's like, I'll include this provision of a bill because I know you want it, or not include this because I know that you want it. So that way we've got chips in the end to trade to get to, a compromise version of the bill. And sometimes that just leads to things not happening. What has been pretty accepted, and right, there's no way to 100% confirm this, is, last session with the bond bill, I run the statewide transfer fee coalition, the LOHA coalition. And what we had heard was that the House didn't include the transfer fee because everyone knew the Senate was going to do it. And that way the House could use that as a bargaining chip to get something that the Speaker wanted. And then the Senate president said, no, I'm not going to give you that bargaining chip. And the transfer fee didn't get done, not because there wasn't support for it, but because it got lost to like political gamesmanship between, two people that can't get along. And so the entire state is suffering because two adults don't know how to like have a conversation and put their differences aside to pass good policy. And that just can, all of those things continue to get worse. And they'll all have really negative impacts on what is happening in Massachusetts.
Yeah, on that note, talking about kind of the way things have devolved, I found that some of the testimony of outgoing lawmakers has been really interesting. But obviously getting those things out of sitting lawmakers is difficult. Have you guys found in your discussions with lawmakers, either, on the record or off, that folks are willing to acknowledge those changes? Or is it more of the same kind of tight-lipped response?
Oh, I at least for me, right? Everybody will acknowledge it in private. And I think I might get a little more candor from a lot of elected officials just because I used to work in the building and I have really close relationships with a lot of them. But yeah, the vast majority of people understand and, will freely in, quiet rooms where no one's listening, freely admit that they know this dysfunction is happening and they're all really upset about the dysfunction. But it becomes really hard, right? If you're, two or three voices and, if you're the two or three people that are brave enough to speak out in a building of 200, it's really easy to alienate and disenfranchise you. And I think especially in, I think this plays out in a certain extent in both chambers, but especially in the House, where speaking out in that way, right, can literally deprive your ability to like bring resources back to your district. That it's a really tough ask to ask a very, very small number of reps or senators to be that vocal opposition when there are real world implications, right? When we know that people, right, don't get resources back for their district in the budget, when we know that policies that otherwise would have been supported don't get passed just because of who is championing it. I get the desire to want your rep or your senator, who you probably, maybe you really like, maybe you don't, but like, to be the voice that speaks out for these things, but there are really, there are big ramifications. And I think especially, I live in Boston. It would be really hard for me to tell my representative who lives in Roxbury to say, you have to go buck the speaker because, right, Roxbury is one of those districts that needs more resources than most places. Right. And so to ask my rep or senator to go out on a limb on their own to do that, I think is a really big ask. Because you don't get anything out of it, right? Until there is a concerted effort from a lot of folks inside that building to say enough is enough. It's really hard to ask people to be out there on an island, especially depending on, where they represent.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. I think that there's not much, there might be like some nodding acknowledgement, but the reps who in senators in general who I interact with do not want to like commiserate about the dysfunction. They don't really want to talk about it. Like they want to change the subject. And I understand why, for the reasons that Mark said, is that like it's access to power that is the biggest variable determining the success or failure of your policy priorities. And so speaking out can have consequences. And so there's very few folks, for understandable reasons, who are willing to do so. And there's even fewer folks who have positions of power within the building who are able to speak up or acknowledge the objective truths about the lack of transparency and dysfunction, which is really challenging. And so it is a big ask for folks to stand up. And it's also a big organizing ask to say that, we're going to behind the scenes organize 80 House reps who are going to come out strong for transparency this next session. So it is a kind of a wicked problem because of the ability to punish reps who speak up for transparency and who criticize the truth about the lack of democratic functioning in both chambers.
All right, thank you both. I think we have time for one more question. So just kind of looking at some of the responses that we've got in the chat, one thing that seems to keep coming up is kind of what can we do about it? So I imagine many of us will be leaving pretty fired up this morning about kind of the dysfunction that we're dealing with. So do you have any advice for folks that are frustrated and looking to make change in our legislature?
I mean, it is exhausting. I think you have to be relentless. I think, like I said, this process is designed to get you to give up. So that when you give up, your legislators get to pretend that these issues aren't there because the people that care about them have stopped talking to them about them. And I think that is really important, right? When we talk about transparency reform, I think we've all seen, quotes from people that identify as progressives in that building talking about how, oh, of all the issues that people talk about, I don't hear any of my constituents talk to me about transparency, right? Which is like partially we know is BS because like people don't always make that connection. But yeah, like I said, I think even if it feels like it's not doing anything, I think keep on emailing and calling your legislator to let them know when, what it is that you want them to do, even if it feels they're not listening, and then get your friends to do it, and then get your friends to get their friends to do it. At the end of the day, the only thing that these people fear more than upsetting leadership is losing their seat, right? At the end of the day, their main goal here is to get reelected. And so the dissatisfaction has to be registered until they either start satisfying you or, hopefully somebody runs against them. And, that happens, which is, a whole separate conversation. But yeah, I think, you've got to be relentless. You have to let your folks know that this does matter, that these are not disconnected, that it's not transparency and then housing issues and environmental issues and, transportation issues, right? This is the through line. And, something has to change because people have to be held accountable. And so don't let the system do what it's designed to do and wear you out. Because that's the purpose. Right. They would all love it if they never heard from another constituent again and could just like go about their shady, shadowy business all by their lonesome. And by they, I don't mean every single individual legislator, to be clear. There are plenty of them that are out there fantastic. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I definitely agree. And yeah, just to reinforce that, so we have a lot of good data from the public, whether it is polling data, whether it's the auditor's question, whether it's the non-binding ballot initiatives that we ran a few years back, is that the public inherently wants transparency. They want a democratic government. They want public record laws to apply. They want committee votes to be transparent. They want roll call votes to occur. And I think as advocates, the one path to get this to change is to slowly change the consensus in the building. And you can do that by reminding your rep that you're paying attention to this. And it doesn't mean that you need to sacrifice the advocacy for all your other priorities, but just own that you care about these other priorities and you care about transparency. And that if your rep wants to agree to disagree on that, then like you can do that, but ask the question and let them know and ask that again and ask them if their position has changed. And I think that one by one, we can change the consensus in the building to get reps on the record to co-sponsor bills in the Sunlight Agenda, to say to their constituents that they do support transparency. And so, yes, you don't need to, that's what I would say, is that you don't need to sacrifice your other priorities, but we do need to include transparency in our advocacy, even if our reps don't agree, to let them know that we are paying attention to what their positions are, and that we want their positions to change. And that's also important to us in addition to our other priorities, because if we don't talk about it, then there's no path for us to change. And so by continuing to bring it up and to make it part of what all the issue advocates are also talking about, it creates the conditions where more reps can find their courage and to be able to speak up publicly because they could have more safety in numbers.
Awesome. Thank you both for what you shared today. This was such a great conversation. And I'm sure that folks might be getting in touch with other questions. We're going to close with a discussion of two concrete policy proposals that are going to be in the state legislature this session that folks can advocate for and talk to their reps about. So I'm going to introduce former lawmaker and Coalition to Reform Our Legislature leader, Jonathan Hecht, to talk about those two proposals.
Thanks, Scotia, and thanks, Mark and Alan, for a great discussion. It's just so heartening to see the two of you talking about this and sharing what you've learned and sharing your commitment to trying to move forward on these issues. It takes a lot of courage. So I really appreciate what you're doing. As Scotia said, I'm going to take some time now. We just have a few minutes left to talk about a couple of specific proposals that you can advocate for with your legislators. These are two bills that were filed in the legislature earlier this month by the Coalition to Reform Our Legislature, which is a coalition of Massachusetts residents. It's working to make our legislature more transparent, more accountable, more effective. My colleague, Jay Kaufman, who's on the call, many of you know him, a former state rep from Lexington, is a member of our steering committee, as is Scotia. And John Lippett from PDM has been a big part of our efforts as well. I just put in the chat the Kroll website, where you can get more details on the two bills, including bill summaries, links to the bills themselves, on the legislature's website, and we hope that you'll contact your legislators and tell them you want them to support them. I've also put my own email address there if you want to follow up with me with any questions. And in filing these two bills, these were filed by us as citizens. We are sending a signal to the legislature that that outside pressure is growing, that the demand for change is going to come from the outside. Jay and I, as former legislators, know well what it's like to work within that building and the obstacles that even the best intentioned legislators face in trying to change the way that institution works. And by filing these bills, we're sending the message we're not going to wait any longer. This is a change that has to come from the outside. Because of the deep structural problems that there are in the legislature. We don't expect these bills are going to pass in this session, but we are sending the message that the public knows what the problems are, the public wants change, and we are very seriously considering taking one or both of these measures to the ballot, which, as we saw in November last year, is a place where we as citizens can express to the legislature exactly what it is we want in terms of how they comport themselves and act in the way that we want to see a democratic legislature operate. So let me just tell you quickly about the two bills. We don't have a lot of time. Again, there's a lot more detail on the website. The first of the two bills is called An Act to Strengthen Representation and Promote Democratic, Transparent, and Efficient Lawmaking. This has got a Senate docket number 1301, a House docket number 4303, and it addresses the pay structure in the legislature. Scotia talked earlier about the problem that we have with our stipend system in Massachusetts and the financial dependency that it creates, that legislators are dependent in Massachusetts for a larger share of their pay, dependent on their chamber leaders, the Senate president, the speaker, the minority party leaders. Our legislators are more dependent for their pay on their relationship with their leaders than any other legislature in the country. We are an extreme outlier in this respect. And as Scotia was saying, the appointment to these positions that carry these stipends is totally in the control of these these leaders. And it's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money in total. It's about $5 million a year now that these legislative leaders control in pay. And for individual legislators, getting one of these stipends means a boost of your pay of anywhere between 10% and 120% above the base pay, which is currently $82,000. So it's a huge economic incentive. And conversely, if you fail to stay in a legislative leader's good graces, you can see a significant cut in your income. It's just crazy that we allow legislators to be compensated in this way, where they are more financially dependent on their legislative leaders than they are on we, the constituents who they represent. And this obviously undermines their independence. And it's just a huge part of the, this follow the leader culture that we have in our legislature, and all of the problems that Alan and Mark were talking about, the low levels of participation, transparency, productivity, et cetera. So the bill that Kroll, the committee to coalition to reform our legislature, has filed would drastically reduce the number of stipends controlled by leadership and shift most of that money to a new stipend that would not be under the control of leadership for expanded participation by rank and file legislators in the work of legislative committees. And the other thing that the bill does is it would reform the way in which those committees themselves operate to make them more democratic, more transparent, more accountable, essentially to create an environment in which legislators newly liberated, newly autonomous because of changes in the pay structure, would actually be able to actively and independently shape legislation. I saw some conversation in the chat about committees in Massachusetts. Committees are supposed to be the workhorses of the legislative process. But today in Massachusetts, they're basically irrelevant. They hold public hearings, which are very sparsely attended by legislators, but after that, they never meet again. The bills are reported out of committee without any public discussion, public debate, or public votes. And the result is that the committee members are disempowered, the public and the advocates are left totally in the dark, and the lobbyists and the special interests have a field day working behind closed doors. So the Kroll bill would condition the payment of stipends for leadership all the way up to the Senate president and the speaker and committee chairs on all bills being handled in a democratic, transparent, and accountable way through public meetings, public markups, and votes. This is just absolutely standard practice in other legislatures, and it will go a long ways toward curtailing the practice we have in Massachusetts now of lawmaking happening behind closed doors. The second bill, I'll try to be very quick, I know we're almost at the end, is an act to establish offices of legislative research and fiscal analysis. Massachusetts, again, is an outlier. We are the only state in the country whose legislature has no offices or committees dedicated to providing research and support for legislators. Legislators are really at the mercy of leadership in terms of the flow of information and have to depend largely on lobbyists and outside groups for information and oftentimes for drafts of legislation that really should be their responsibility and their prerogative to develop as our representatives. This is an idea that's been pushed by the state auditor in her report. The Boston Globe has endorsed it. And the idea, again, is to empower rank and file legislators to do the kind of work that we elect our representatives to do. So both of these bills are about expanding participation, about getting more voices to the table, about increasing transparency and public accountability. They're about democratizing our legislature. Taking the power to make laws out of the hands of a few powerful people and the special interests that have privileged access to them, and returning it to all of our representatives, working openly and accountably. So sorry to have taken us a little over time. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Again, reach out to your legislators, let them know that you want favorable action on these bills. You want to see them empowered as your representative, and that you will have their backs if they step up and take on the power structure. And also let them know we're not going to wait. If they can't do it, we're going to do it ourselves through the ballot if necessary. So I'll stop there. Again, reach out to me if you have any questions. Scotia, back to you.
Thanks so much, John. We're a little over time, so we're just going to wrap it up really quickly. Thank you all for joining us today. I think I'm going to pass it back over to our host from Progressive Dems of Mass just to send us out. But I put my email in the chat for anybody that has follow-up questions. Really appreciate everyone coming out today.
Great. Thank you so much, Scotia, Alan, Mark, and John. Just very quickly, PDM is looking to build and work with Kroll to expand the network pushing for this. So if you know of anybody or any group that would like to get engaged with the Legislative Reform Initiative, please go to our website and just click on the Contact Us button and send us the contact information for that individual or group. Thank you so much for highlighting the impact, the consequences of our legislative dysfunction. We simply can't get good common sense bills passed in a timely fashion in Massachusetts most of the time. And the other thing I note is it trims our vision. So for example, on the election front, we're pushing for same-day voter registration to delink the local census from voting rolls, but we're not even talking about clean elections and public financing of elections. Come on, folks. It's because we know we can't get this done in this legislature. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for your support and interest in this issue. And I look forward to working with you all as we go ahead and address the dysfunction in our Massachusetts legislature. Thank you so much.